from Columbia in high definition. This is WIS News 10 Awareness.
Election night in South Carolina ended in a Republican sweep, leaving very few Democratic victories. Where do we go from here? Thank you for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. Joining me now to talk about the future of the state's parties are Jamie Harrison, chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Todd Shaw, a political science professor at USC, and Matt Moore, chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party. Thank you all for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as I said, Republican sweep on election night. Jamie, what would you say is your biggest critique of your party?
Oh, the biggest critique of the party. Well, I don't have a critique of our party. I think that the biggest thing that we need to do a better job of doing the next time around in the next set of elections is making sure we get our message out there, making sure that the image of the Democratic Party is one that we promote. You know, here in South Carolina, and I think all across the South, and you're seeing a lot of articles about it, there's a lot of racial stratification as it relates to the parties, whereas some folks look at the Democratic Party as a black party and the Republican Party as a white party. It's not about that. Basically, the Democratic Party for me is a party of opportunity, regardless if you're black or white, gay or straight, Christian or Jewish, that there's a home for you in the Democratic Party. And we want to make sure that you can live up to those God-given opportunities that you have. And so that's the challenge that we have here in South Carolina, is to make sure that all voters understand that.
So making sure your message targets all of those bases, all of those
Exactly
groups.
right. Exactly right.
Okay. So Matt, what would you say is, I don't even think there really is a critique, I suppose, for you. You guys really got your message out there. What do you credit to that?
Well, Governor Haley had more votes this election than she had last time. Vince Shaheen, who ran for the Democrats, had about 100,000 less votes than last time. Governor Haley had a very strong record as governor over the past 4 years, and I think very strongly presented her vision for the next 4 years. What we saw from the Democrats was a really negative campaign for Vincent Shaheen with no ideas for South Carolina, and I think the voters recognized that. That was a story nationally, historic margins for Republicans across the country, governorships, Senate seats, legislative seats locally. So it creates a lot of momentum for the party going forward. So
you think her message and her track record really carried all the voters forward?
Well, voters are worried about their pocketbooks over the past couple of years, especially with the national currents. And so Governor Haley had a message of jobs, of opportunity, of giving people a leg up to the middle class and good paying jobs, and that's a very strong message.
And Professor Shaw, let's talk a little bit about the stumbling block here for the Democratic Party. What did you see it as being?
Well, in some ways it was a national stumbling block, but that's no consolation to a statewide party. I mean, there was a national wave going on where Republicans were clearly energized. But if you look in South Carolina, this energy that built for Republicans built fairly early. You know, there is already a challenge that the Democrats have in terms of the number of registered voters who identify, and Republicans showed up to those primaries at a 3-to-1 advantage over Democrats. So there, back in the spring, you had that building momentum. Here in South Carolina, the challenge also is, I characterize it as the lack of a swing voter or a moderate independent voter. So the parties are kind of divided. There is some ways in which race fairly plays into that. And so that's some of what going forward the Democrats and the Republicans have to see as a challenge.
Right. Now, Jamie, there were some victories on local level. How do you translate that into a statewide election, even a national election?
Yeah, if you take a look at the Democratic presence in terms of the big cities here in South Carolina, you take a look at county councils, you look at sheriffs, we are very much on par with the Republicans in terms of holding those elected offices. You know, one of the things that I want folks to, yes, the Republicans won all of the statewide races. Well, they held them before. So if you want to take a look at what this election's about, in essence, is a net zero election, because there wasn't a whole lot that changed from the election night to what current day is. Republicans held those seats. They won those seats again. And so we have to just continue our efforts. And this is what I've been telling all Democrats is you put your head down, you roll up your sleeves, you continue to work, because we will continue to move the ball forward. If you take a look at the demographics of the young people who voted in the election, basically Vincent Shaheen beat Nikki Haley 59 to 39 in terms of 18 to 29-year-olds. So we believe that there's some momentum there. We understand there's some generational things in terms of the attachments to the parties, but we believe that there's a base there that we can build upon to once again become the majority party here in the state of South Carolina.
Well, if nothing really changed in terms of the Republican control, how does your tactic then have to change?
Well, again, it all goes back to message, and it's making sure that we continue to talk to those the new generations that are growing up here in South Carolina, that are coming into their own here in South Carolina, who will be the next leaders in this next generation. And so as long as we can continue to do that and then appeal to various segments of the population, we need to do a better job of talking to women, particularly white women, here in the state of South Carolina about, again, the opportunities that the Democratic Party presents for them. Again, if you take a look, you start to parcel through the data, you'll find that women, single women, voted overwhelmingly for Vincent Shaheen. Married women, on the other hand, didn't. And so again, you have to take a look at the numbers, look at where your foundation is, and build upon that foundation.
And Matt, you talked a little bit about Governor Haley's message, but how did the Republican Party, what was their strategy in terms of actually getting the voters out there, getting information to them?
Did a few things, actually 3 things. First and foremost, we targeted low-frequency voters, the kind of voters who vote presidential elections only, get them out to the polls. Secondly, we used technology in a way we'd never used before. Our social media metrics, particularly Facebook, this election cycle, were massive. Over 2 million voter impressions for Amendment 2, for example, 2 million voter impressions for our Get Out the Vote efforts for Governor Haley, Tim Scott, and Senator Lindsey Graham. And thirdly, we started a ground game earlier than we've ever done before in our history, about 12 months ahead of time, starting last November, and sort of building out 14 offices statewide, 13 field staffers to be out in the communities, having conversations with voters, connecting with them on a personal level, and not just showing up 4 weeks before the election. People want to be heard.
Right.
And when you're discussing the issues that they care about, you get rewarded at the polls.
Right. And so you credit that strategy.
I do. I most certainly do.
It's an overwhelming victory.
I do.
And Professor Shaw, before we go to our break, let's talk a little bit about the difference between the message and the party. Do you think people should be so focused on the individual parties or more so the message?
Well, I think it's hard in some respects. People vote along party lines in many respects. Even when they say they are independent, they will lean toward one party or the other. And sometimes I think it is clear that parties have to make distinctions, but parties also have to mobilize. This, on a national scale, this election is among the lowest turnouts we've had since World War II. In South Carolina, since the early 1970s. So we're talking about mostly we had an election and a lot of people didn't show up. Right. And so mobilization on both sides with the parties is key. And the parties debate about what are the barriers to voting, which is another question. Mm-hmm. But mobilizing and getting people to the polls and making them care, I guess, to get them to the polls is key.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation coming up after our break. Welcome back to Awareness. We continue our discussion about the 2014 midterm elections, what it means for South Carolina, and how it aligns with the national scene. Our panelists include Jamie Harrison, chairman of the State Democratic Party, USC professor Todd Shaw, and Matt Moore, chairman of the State Republican Party. Thanks again for being with us. Professor Shaw, I want to pick up where you just left off about mobilizing the voters and also some of the barriers to voting. What are some of the typical barriers we see?
Well, typically in political science, we talk about there's always cost to voting in the sense that, what else would people be doing if they weren't voting? Certainly, you have to be mindful of the fact that voting is the central right that citizens have. It defines citizenship. And so, I'm sympathetic to those who say folks should vote anyway. But if you say vote anyway, the question is, the question of what does it take in terms of registration. There are the ongoing debates about the questions of these voter ID laws and the reductions in early voting in some states. So these do present barriers. We've puzzled as to why can't voting be a national holiday. But anyway, there are all types of ways in which we should think about how do we make access to the ballot greater access so that citizens can exercise that key right. But that clearly are some of the barriers we talk about when we talk about voting.
Right, and you brought up mobilizing voters. Jamie,
Sure.
you've talked about your message. How do you re-energize and try to mobilize the voters for a more positive outcome moving forward?
Well, I think, you know, the issue that we have is mobilizing our voters in non-presidential election years. If you take a look at the presidential election years, you know, there's no issue about mobilizing voters because the interest is very high.
Right.
And so, you know, this year, similar to what Matt did, we started earlier as well. We started actually with a field program in August of last year. In the last closing days of the election, we talked to over the phone in the 5 days of the closing of the election, we talked to over 400,000 people, knocked on over 100,000 doors. And so one of the things that I think it's just really important, it's not that you know, the parties aren't, or the Democratic Party isn't reaching out to voters, it's just finding the message to get the voters interested. And that's going to be particularly important in future elections. One of the things I would like to also talk about as it relates to you know, voter ID and some of these other issues, you know, voting is a fundamental building block for our democracy. But yet we seem to find, and I know there have been problems in Texas and other states, all of these barriers that we place in front of the voters to actually exercise that right. We need to do a better job as a nation, and I would hope that Republicans would work with Democrats to find ways to make it easier. Americans are working so hard these days, much harder than they've worked in the past. So why do we find ways in order to make it more difficult for them to vote and to stand in these long lines? I think we can find some effort. We find resources for everything else that we want to do. Why can't we find resources in order to make sure that it's easy for voters to go out?
And one topic I want to go back to, you mentioned it earlier, is the topic of race. I'm hearing a lot of speculation out there saying, you know, they just didn't get the black vote. How do you target the black vote? Do you target the black vote?
Well, and that's a fallacy, because if you, again, take a look at the numbers, I mean, the African-American turnout in this year's election was very similar to that of African-American turnout in 2010. Where Vincent came short was that he lost a large share of the white vote in the party, and that's when I'm talking about the racial stratification. If you take a look at the numbers, African Americans came out in 2010 was the highest year of a non-presidential year for African American turnout in the state of South Carolina. We mimicked that this year. So it wasn't that the African Americans didn't come out in order to support, you know, the Democrats and Vincent Shaheen. Part of the issue was that the Democratic Party and the Shaheen campaign, we lost a large share of the white vote in the state, and that we can't have.
Matt, how does race factor in when we talk about the Republican Party? I know that everyone says, well, race should never be a factor. You know, we're not a racial party. But obviously there are certain tactics and strategies where you are trying to target certain groups.
Well, what I would say, if you look at the results last Tuesday across the country, Tim Scott from South Carolina, for example, African American, is the first person in either party to ever be elected to the House and the U.S. Senate, a pretty amazing thing. In Utah, the first African American woman Republican ever elected to the U.S. House, Mia Love. So all these great things are happening. Look, we want as many people to vote as possible. We think we can compete on the ideas with any party, with any candidate, and be successful. And so I think the idea that anyone is against people voting is crazy. We want as many people to vote as possible. That is a most fundamental right in this country, but we want to protect it and get people to the polls.
Right. And so, Professor Shah, moving forward, obviously with the Republican majority, the topic now really should be compromise. You know, how do we get things done? How do we work together? How do you see that happening? Do you see compromise happening?
I don't. I think we are setting the groundwork for 2016 in the next 2 years. Although I think there are things that both parties need to be mindful of. You should take voter apathy as a signal as well. It's an indication that there is something that in various ways voters have disengaged. And if they've disengaged, why have they disengaged? The economy's improving. We've seen some improvements. So why the level of disengagement? There are a host of issues that the nation, but in particular South Carolina, confront, whether it be roads, whether it be schools, whether it be health care. So there isn't time to waste, but I'm a little, excuse my political cynicism, just a little, that we will see a little bit more of the same in the next 2 years.
Matt?
People strongly dislike this president's policies. I think for average people, all these metrics the Democrats throw around about how the economy is doing, the average person is not feeling it. And that explains the discontent with the Democrats nationally and the discontent with Democrats here with a candidate like Vincent Shaheen, who was bought in to President Obama's policies. And it's no surprise that those policies were strongly defeated. The president's been a really bad salesman for his party. I think these guys probably would admit it. Maybe not on camera, but at least maybe privately. The president's been a really bad salesman for his policies, too disengaged nationally, and national Democrats and state Democrats here paid the price.
Well, President Obama did say that there was a lack of really pushing the message and persuading voters, so he did at least acknowledge that. But Jamie, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I would disagree with Matt on that notion.
Sure.
You know, Matt likes to talk about the popularity of the president. Well, the popularity of Congress is 8%. You know, the potholes on the roads in South Carolina probably are more popular than Congress is right now. So I wouldn't get into that notion. But the one point that I want to make is this. It is, you know, I saw an election like this, a wave election in 2004. Republicans won all of the Senate seats in the South. They recaptured the presidency. George Bush was reelected. Well, in 2006, what happened? Democrats won the House, they won the Senate. 2008, what happened? Democrats won the presidency. There's a political pendulum in this country, it always has been, but for the past 20 years or so, it has been extremely erratic. So the one thing that I would give to Matt and my Republican friends is that don't be all confident about your policies and all, because it's not about that. The American people just aren't satisfied where we're going as a nation on a political front. And so it's not the Democrats' policies better or the Republicans' policies better. It's that the American people just aren't satisfied with what they're getting from either party. And so that's something that we need to work on.
Well, I know we can continue talking about this for hours, but thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Still to come on Awareness, he was one of the youngest leaders to be elected to the South Carolina State House, and he was recently in the running to become Lieutenant Governor. Bakari Sellers joins us after the break. Welcome back to Awareness. Bakari Sellers became a state representative at the age of 22. 8 years later, he is still finding a way to serve the community while pursuing higher ambitions. Bakari, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So, election night happened. It's over now. How are you dealing with the result?
Well, we ran a very good race. We had a good debate. We had a good strategy. But you have to respect the voice of the voters. And what we found out is that Democrats in South Carolina didn't have a message that resonated with the voters of South Carolina. We couldn't excite people. And it showed on November 4th. So I'm still learning a lot from that election. But one thing that hasn't left is my optimism for the future. And as I told people on election night, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be a part of the change that we want to see in South Carolina.
And how exactly do you plan on doing that?
Well, the first thing we want to do is just talk to voters and see what we did not do right. Personally, I'm going to work on myself, work on my faith, work on my family. For the past 8 years, I've been dedicated to public service so much. I'm going to practice law at the Strom Law Firm and do all those things to make me a better person. But I'm also going to talk about issues like minimum wage. I'm also going to talk about issues like gaming, bringing gaming to South Carolina. We're going to talk about rebuilding our rural schools. And over the next few months or years, we'll see if that message is one that resonates with voters.
Do you see yourself continuing to be a strong leader within the Democratic Party?
I believe so.
Re-energizing the party?
Yeah, I think so. I think it takes not just in South Carolina, but on the national level as well. And I hope that people will begin to hear what we're echoing. But I think that it takes a Bakari Sellers sharing the stage with a Bill Clinton or James Clyburn. We have to begin to let go and begin to share some of those leadership posts. Because what happens is that our voices and the people who represent us are not necessarily ginning up the energy we need to be victorious. And that was not just in South Carolina, but it was in Maryland, it was in Illinois. Yeah. So I look forward to the future of the party.
What would you say are some of the biggest lessons you've learned from all of this, including your 8 years?
Well, I've learned that South Carolina's made a lot of progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. We have kids who go to schools, which their infrastructure is still falling apart. We have hospitals that are shutting down. We have infrastructure that's not indicative of a 21st century global economy. And my party, the Democratic Party, has become stagnant with ideas. I think whomever the candidate is in 2016 against Tim Scott, which is the next obstacle, and then 2018, who's going to lead and carry the torch, should talk about minimum wage and getting it to 1010, should talk about bringing gaming to South Carolina, and should have a robust plan for educating our kids and getting them out of these dilapidated schools.
But overall, you see a rebound for the Democratic Party.
Well, it can't get any worse. Yeah, I see a rebound. But I did not do my job this year.
So you're putting it on yourself.
Well, I mean, I have to. I mean, I was the candidate. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm very thankful for the 500,000 people that came out and voted. At 30 years old, having 505,000 people who believe that you should be the second highest office holder in the state means a lot. But we didn't get over the hump. And we have to have bigger ideas. I believe ideas win elections. And I'm not going to lose another election in South Carolina for not having the best ideas. Republicans have the privilege of just being able to run as Republicans. But in South Carolina, we cannot simply say that I'm not them. We have to do a better job of communicating. And whether or not it's minimum wage, whether or not it's gaming, or whether or not it's a plan to focus dollars, bond revenue on these schools that are falling apart, is something we have to do. So I don't know if it's 16 or 18 or 20 or 22, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'll be around for a while.
All right, Bakari Sellers, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back with a final thought. Whatever your party affiliation might be, the message should matter more. Stay engaged, stay aware, find the substance behind the rhetoric, and vote to make sure your voice is being heard. We'd like to thank all of our guests this morning. Matt Moore, chairman of the State Republican Party, Todd Shaw, USC Political Science professor, Jamie Harrison, chairman of the State Democratic Party, and Bakari Sellers. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.